Hi, I'm Paul Denicola. I'm a partner with PwC's Governance Insight Center, and I'm here with my colleagues, Matt DiGiuseppe and Tracy Lee Brown, both from the Governance Insight Center. The ESG landscape is really evolving quickly, and boards need to evolve with it in order to keep pace. So today we're going to briefly hit on four important topics in the ESG space. One is how companies are approaching linking ESG and their approach to strategy. Secondly, we're going to look at recent trends around data and disclosure as it relates to ESG. Third, we're going to look at how boards are allocating responsibility for oversight over ESG, how they're structuring it at the board level. And finally, we're going to look at the issue of climate change and how new potential rules could impact companies. Matt, maybe I'll start with you on the issue of strategy. How has this connection between ESG and the way in which boards are looking at strategy evolved?
Thanks, Paul. That's a really great question because the connection between ESG and strategy is evolving quite rapidly. I'd say in the past, but the reality is that currently ESG issues are generally considered alongside strategy, or maybe as it's being developed and set. But companies really need to be thinking about how do they integrate ESG into strategy. So it's simply part of the process. It's not an agenda item that says ESG, it just is part of it. As people think about ESG and that thinking evolves from being sort of climate change alone or these corporate social responsibility issues to really be, what are the key risks and opportunities of the non-financial type that affect the company and how are we incorporating them? There's a recognition that these topics need to be dealt with as part of the strategy, not necessarily something that happens alongside or after it. And when you do that, it also means that you have to think about changing the way you approach it. You have to understand how these issues impact the outlook for the organization, the financial modeling, capital expenditures, forecasting, and really dig into these topics as you're setting strategies so you make sure that you account for ESG risks and opportunities. An example of which is in the restaurant industry. More and more we're seeing restaurants incorporate, vegan or plant-based options on their menu, expanding sort of their offerings. And that's because they've recognized sort of two things. One is that there's an opportunity to attract new customers, maybe increase margins or think about sort of how they can, create better opportunities for the business. But they also recognize that there's a risk if you're not courting these new customers, they're going to go elsewhere, as we saw with sort of the fast casual industry taking away from sort of your traditional fast food restaurants when they weren't as quick to respond. And so, what that really means is that the integration between ESG and strategy does need to evolve and really quickly so that boards are really thinking about challenging management on how they are incorporating these ideas and concepts into the process rather than alongside or after sort of your traditional strategy.
Yeah. So it sounds like there's a clear movement from ESG being a bolt-on to strategy to being fully integrated into how boards are looking at one of their core responsibilities, and that's oversight over strategy. So thanks for all that. I want to shift to you, Tracy, and to a different topic, and that is on data, ESG data, and disclosure. Can you talk a little bit about what's changed in that environment?
Yeah, sure. So, Paul, I think it's important to distinguish between the evolution of disclosures as well as data and data reliability. And I'm going to start with disclosures. Companies are broadening their disclosures. They are outlining their ESG risks and opportunities, the board oversight, ESG metrics. They are setting ESG goals and targets, and they are disclosing how they are tracking and measuring their progress against that. I'd say just in general as well, companies are disclosing their ESG strategy and how it's integrated into the broader business strategy. I'd also say that another change that we've seen is that disclosures have moved outside, or in addition to the corporate social responsibility or ESG report, it's also made its way into SEC filings as well as onto company websites. When we look at data and data reliability, companies are definitely making strides here too. They are moving away from manual spreadsheet tracking and collection of data to investing in ESG technologies that enable them to collect and track data, as well as report on ESG information in a more accurate and reliable manner. They are moving away from only collecting data on an annual basis and collecting data more frequently, as well as reporting and analyzing that data more frequently. They are putting in place processes, controls, as well as just procedures to enhance and ensure the accuracy and the reliability of the ESG information. And then finally, I'd say that some companies are also obtaining assurance over the ESG information, and that just enhances the credibility of the data that they are disclosing. I would say that a key takeaway for boards is to know that the ESG disclosure and reporting landscape is evolving, and companies are making various investments. Boards should be aware of the company's current disclosures and how that tracks against their peers, understand where the company is from a maturity perspective as well. And then finally, I'd say that they should challenge management on the reliability of the information. After all, investors and other stakeholders are relying on this information.
Yeah, that was what I was thinking exactly, Tracy, and that is all of this movement around looking at data differently is all in the service of providing investor grade information to the markets. So that was great. I do want to pivot a little bit. One of the questions that I frequently get from boards when it relates to ESG is how they're allocating oversight, whether ESG is happening at the full board or individual committees of the board. But Matt, maybe you could speak a little bit to the issue of board oversight and how boards are taking a look at their responsibilities around ESG.
Yeah, this is one of those topics where, very similar to strategy, there's a shift going on from sort of taking an ad hoc or informal approach to the board, thinking about their ESG oversight responsibilities, to very quickly move towards a much more structured, formal approach to that. I think when ESG was first coming sort of forward as a topic that needed board level oversight, it was frequently given to the full board for lack of a really good place to put it otherwise, or the nominating and governance committee, because they always seem to have capacity, right? Versus audit or compensation. But really, I think now that companies get their hands around it and they think about ESG as part of the strategy rather than something that's bolted on, like we talked about earlier, there's a recognition that the board needs to allocate oversight in a way that's not dissimilar from the way that they think about allocating oversight for the company's operating strategy. So the more mature companies are really thinking about the audit committee has responsibilities for data quality and disclosure, like Tracy just talked about. The Nom and Gov committee has responsibilities for, skills and sort of some of those other issues around management structure. The compensation committee can have a role around integrating ESG incentives into the compensation program. And so boards are thinking about a number of things in this capacity. One is, first and foremost, do the current board members have the skills that they need in order to address these issues in those various capacities? There's generally no one that has ESG, expertise. It's a broad topic, like I just laid out. But in those various capacities, you can question, do we have a director that at least has some skills and knowledge in that context? And then, more importantly, thinking about how do we evolve the charters of our committees to better, solidify the way that the board is overseeing these topics and create a communication to the investor community, to management, to stakeholders more broadly, that these topics are important to the board and they're things that they are thinking about and doing something on. And we know boards are doing things on ESG because from our annual directors survey, this year, 52% of boards said ESG is a regular part of their board agenda. There aren't a lot of topics, maybe other than CEO succession, that you would give that sort of regular part of the board agenda moniker to. So it is important, and that's up from 34% in 2019. So you can see it's very clearly moving. And companies are telling shareholders more about it, right? Whether it's through the proxy statement, through the board committee charters or other communications in their corporate social responsibility reports, they're laying out sort of how the board is overseeing these issues and thinking about them strategically. And so, what that means is for maybe the 50% where it's not a regular part of the agenda, the board should probably lean in and, understand sort of how they're overseeing these topics. Have they made that shift from informal to formal? And have they thought about, do you have the right people in the room to understand these risks and opportunities and really act as a partner to management and taking advantage of them and mitigating them?
Great perspectives, Matt. I know we only have a little bit more time. So Tracy, I want to turn to you for the final question, and that's around climate change. Clearly, Europe was advanced in this area. The US is taking action, particularly right now. What are the considerations from a governance point of view around oversight of climate change, climate risk?
Sure. So looking back, I'd say that a small number of companies were focused on climate change and specifically thinking about how climate change impacts the company, as well as how the company impacts climate, right? And I'd say that those companies were probably in industries and sectors with higher carbon emissions. But just given I think the elevation of climate change on the various stakeholder agendas, it's almost forced companies to act. We know that investors are asking companies to measure and mitigate climate risks. Paul, you just mentioned, and that we know that in the US, the current administration is focused on climate change. And then most recently, the SEC also proposed rules around climate change risks and just disclosing how that impacts the company. We've also seen a number of companies come out and make commitments voluntarily to reduce their carbon emissions. So I'd say this is definitely an evolving space right now. And for boards, the main thing would be to educate themselves on the topic of climate, understand what are the climate risks and opportunities impacting the company, impacting the industry, know how the company's strategy, the outlook, the investments will be changing to address climate change. And then specifically for those companies that have made commitments, the board would definitely want to understand what is the company's strategy to meet those commitments.
Yeah. Well, thank you both for joining me today. This was really insightful. For more information on how boards can navigate the evolving ESG landscape, please go to our website. Thanks a lot.